So we'll now be able to hear from 3 of our 4 presenters in a panel discussion moderated by Bob Sachs. By the way, Bob is an accomplished author in his own right, most recently publishing The Path of Civility, Perfecting the Lessons of a President, that is President Washington, by applying the wisdom of a Buddha. So during these panel discussions, you may ask questions of our panelists in the comment bar, and Bob will get to as many of those as he is able. So please keep track of it. If he didn't get to it, you'll get another chance during the breakout sessions, perhaps, to ask those questions. So here is Bob on a panel with Sharon and Edgar and David. So please enjoy.
Thank you all. We're basically just setting up the props so I can be seen. Because this is all very, very high tech, as you are very, very well aware. So I want to thank you all for being here. It's great meeting you, Reverend Anderson. First time, wonderful to hear you speak. Obviously, I've known David and Edgar for years and years and years, so it's an honor to be in this space with all 3 of you.
Thank you.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was that more than likely, we're good. We're good. More than likely, many of the people that are listening, they're not neophytes to the concept of civility. I would say many of them probably have done what, what John Lewis talked about in terms of getting involved with good trouble, looking at those issues. But in conversation with people about this conference, there is a kind of, I would say, jadedness in terms of the benefits of civility. And I know what's interesting about what you, David, talked about with respect to your description of your conversation with your friend. You're looking at a very long-term view of how civility seeds possibilities for the future. So with that in mind, the question I would like to ask all of you is, how do we re-enlist the people that I would say have done the good fight for many, many years, who may at this point sort of have either packed it up or packed it in, or not wanted to engage or see the benefit of civility way beyond what all of you agreed to, is that civility is not the play nice card. There's a lot more to it. So how do we begin to re-stimulate or touch these people who could really contribute to the importance of civility in our current world? And I'm opening up to the panel. Whichever one of you wants to start. Age before beauty, beauty before age, wisdom before whatever. I'm just going to open it up to all of you to, maybe what I'll do is I'll turn to Dr. Sharon, Reverend Sharon first. And maybe if you started off, and then we'll follow through everybody else.
Great. I'll say that's age before beauty then. So it's certainly a pleasure to be with all of you, David and Edgar. Just phenomenal. I don't know if you remember me, Edgar. When I was teaching at Georgetown, I had a number of students that, I met you then as a student in the criminal justice clinic. And then certainly when I started the Howard University Criminal Justice Clinic. And so we interacted with your clinical program. So quite an honor to be with you today. So it's a great question. And there's not an easy answer to it. But I think in springboarding off of Edgar's concept, as well as what David was talking about, and certainly going back to emotional civility, our time and our season right now and what's going on in our world is crying for intervention. And I think that those that may have been jaded about civility and what it means and why we're not progressing in that area really do see that we do see it, and we do sense the need and the urgency to become re-engaged. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that people understand that it's time to engage and re-engage, and how do we encourage them? One of the ways that I'm looking to do that is not only introducing this quote unquote new paradigm, and it's not really new, it's just a different twist on some things. But we have to look at every level of our society and interject the conversation. And that's where we go back to Edgar's concept. We really do have to get back to basics. And so we have to start with our youth. We have to start with those generations that are traditionally affected by it, but really don't understand the concept. And we have to get away from the traditional definitions, as David suggested, of trust and of difference and of power, and begin to teach them what civility means and what the interaction in this space of civility means. And so I would say it's a re-education. We have to start with educating and re-educating those who are involved in this discussion about what re-engagement means in the fight.
I want to start by saying how much I appreciate hearing each of you, and how just nurturing that has been to reaffirm old relationships and core values. Part of what I think we need to do is what I do with my students, which is to ask them, when they come together and don't know each other, to share an instance of injustice to which they were subjected, and to ask what did they do then, what would they do now? Because I think part of how we learn is not just by reaching toward the positive, but by reawakening our familiarity with with times when that's been broken. It's sort of, how do you extend trust? My answer to that was, if actions could leave digital footprints, they wouldn't evaporate. They couldn't be forgotten. And so there would be a consequence to incivility, because it would remain, it would mean that their ability to connect had consequences. And so I think that actions of incivility should have consequences, as well as civility. The other question is, how do you reward civility when civility ought to be the basic sort of ground rules? It's sort of, just as we have grammar, we have nouns and we have verbs and pronouns. Civility is really the basic grammar of everything else in what we do. And David, your outline of those 5 principles, I just say it was so classy. It was a joy to hear, and I was busy taking notes. But I'm indebted to Robert for giving me this treat. So thank you so much.
I have nothing to add what these two wise beings have said.
Well, then let me move on to looking at this, and this has to do, Edgar, with the conversation, or actually part of your one book on time banks, where you gave the example of going into a class of pre-med students and asking them the question, who provides the greatest amount of healthcare hours in the United States? And they were going through the whole idea of, well, maybe it's nurses, maybe it's physicians' assistants. And then you said, no, the simple answer is mothers. And, because if your mother didn't keep you warm, if she didn't keep you fed, she might not be the most emotionally intelligent person on the planet, but in terms of your basic needs, there she is. And so to me, I was actually, the question I was pondering while you were all talking is, how do you think this lockdown has impacted civility? Because suddenly mothers have had to become mothers, fathers have had to become fathers. So many people have had to be inside their homes, possibly for the first time, quite possibly maybe sitting down to dinner for the first time. So the question I have is, have you seen, or what have you observed with respect to this pandemic and the concept of civility?
Well, I think the first principle is that actions have consequences. And many times we don't have to, we can run from those consequences. The conversation ends. We haven't done anything terribly bad, uh, but when you're together and you can't get away from each other, the notion that what you say uh, reverberates, and you're there and you're trapped in the world that you're trapped in, you maybe think differently about what you say and how you react. But the other thing is, how do we reward caring and decency, and how do we celebrate it? Because it's so quickly forgotten. It's so quickly not taken for granted as, oh, that was a nice thing, but nice evaporates. And I think that what you've done in holding this conference is to say we need to bring it to a different level of awareness. It needs to be part of the the ethics that we learn, and part of how we compute the consequences of what we say. And that's a different vision of what it means to act. And it parallel when you take that to a different level, as I do thinking about systems, I take it to the difference between the core economy with its operating systems and the market economy with its operating systems. And we're really talking about how do we rebuild, how do we renew the core economy that makes relation of trust and intimacy that makes relations possible. And above all, that means how do we expose vulnerability? And how do we take the risk of vulnerability? Because all of us are more fragile than we admit, and all of us want to protect ourselves. But real risk is exposing being willing to take the risk of fragility, being willing to take the risk of being wrong, and and setting in motion a corrective mechanism that you want to hear and are open to.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the quarantine exposed where we are on what I call the emotional stability spectrum. And I like to think of emotional stability as this lane, this highway, right? It's a 4-lane highway, and then there's this exit ramp. And so you get hit with something. Do you choose to stay on that path and go down the path of, you know, hitting your kid in the mouth because they said, are we there yet? Or, you know, saying something derogatory to your spouse? Or do you take the civility exit and respond with those concepts that David so classically mentioned? And so I think that the quarantine really exposed where we are. And one thing that hit me as we were talking, which actually kind of builds on the first question, is both Edgar and I are professors of clinical education. Antioch and David Clark's law school was one of the first law schools that really engaged in clinical legal education practice. So you take a concept, you teach students how to apply it, and before they leave that school, they're ready to practice law, just like a doctor, just like a psychologist. Whereas for years as lawyers, you could hang a shingle and never have engaged in the practice of law. And then you learn from your mistakes. And some of those mistakes were horrible, and some of those mistakes, or most of those mistakes, were less impactful to the individual and more impactful to the person that you were representing. Hence the need for civility education and something practical. Over the course of the pandemic, the divorce rates have increased, and I've studied that. As a pastor, we see it. The number of marriages and marital counseling instances have increased. The issues of child abuse have increased during the course of the pandemic and quarantine, because people are forced to be in the same space without the education of civility. And so it really begins with a re-education, but as I think all of us said, not just from a conceptual perspective, but a practical perspective. It's more than just lip service. It's more than just definition. It's how do we put these things into practice? Because what the quarantine, I think, exposed is that we don't know. we don't know. We're not clear on how to manage our emotions. We don't engage in what Bob Thurman said, which is true mindfulness practices, or just the 10-second rule, pause before you speak and act. And so the quarantine and the pandemic really hit us hard. And I do believe that true practical civility education is key.
It's very interesting. Someone sent a paraphrase of Michelle Obama, where she said the quarantine did not make you who you are, it revealed who you are.
That's right. That's right. That's it. That's it.
And the other thing that came to me in terms of what Edgar was talking about earlier, and I like to come up with little quotes. So I said, when profit is king, civility is a serf. So what happens is suddenly it becomes subservient to the profit. And when that happens, therefore, the value of it in terms of, the fifth grader learning to take care of the third grader, it does not, it doesn't translate. And I even think in terms of, Reverend Sharon, you're talking about the divorce rates and things like that have gone up. It really is that it has revealed to people that what they've been doing is not really paying attention to the basics.
That's right.
And suddenly what happens is, all right, so divorces happen, whatever happens, but then it's like, once you've shredded your life based on what you thought it was about, what are you going to do now?
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
So one of the questions that I wanted, and this is something that and hopefully this will get a discussion amongst all of you in this. And this was, Robert didn't talk about this during his 10-minute video, but when we first met, when Edgar and David and I and Russ and everybody met together, Robert talked about obviously the fairness doctrine, which he brought up, but then he also talked about the idea of the loyal opposition, the idea that you would have a two-party system that would, after an election, even if they lost, they would agree that on the basis of working for the public good, for the common good, that they would try to run things for the people, even though there were opposing views. And the question I have is that in this current climate where it seems like propriety and decorum are kind of gone, is this feasible in the current climate? And if you thought it was possible to really reestablish a way of bridging what seems to be such a disparity with respect to people being in their own echo chambers, what would you suggest to encourage a bridging of this? What can we do in terms of this conference, in terms of educators, in terms of working with whatever organizations we've worked with to try and bridge that gap?
Well, there are two ways in which I think you do things. One is you reach toward an ideal. The other is you deal with a disparity that offends. And I think that if we made social isolation a common enemy, and took that seriously, it would generate reactions that reach toward your notions of inner and outer civility, David, that really deal with responding to incivility, but it's, incivility is a blame thing. Social isolation is a non-blaming sort of characterization of a situation which has its own toxicity. And so my suggestion would be we all need to deal with something called social isolation and its toxicity as a way of prompting us and as a way of legitimately taking remedial action without installing the blame element in it. That's a
I'd like to hear from David. I haven't heard from you, David.
I read something a few years ago that I found fascinating, which traced the incivility and polarization in Congress to a particular change, which was congressmen and women, senators, would go home on the weekends instead of stay in Washington.
Huh.
And what happened when people were staying was that, they went to baseball games. They found out, they played pickup basketball together. They knew each other's children's names. They were sensitive to their colleagues who might have been in some sort of tragic situation or had a loved one who was ill. They knew about each other's lives. And then, kind of to your point, Edgar, around the British way of being able to sort of fuss and fight without being, just sort of part of the way that we roll. We just sort of lost that. And so we dehumanize people. You're not a human anymore. That's the whole tragedy of the idea of the other. Slavery, all that, weren't actually seen as people.
That's right.
Indigenous people, they were literally seen as less than human.
That's correct.
And somehow we've managed to do that politically, which I just find tragic. And I don't know how to reinstate or change the law so that people hang out with each other and get to know each other.
Right.
I don't have an answer, but I know that's a barrier, that lack of personal intimacy.
And that was actually going to be my comment as well. The need for interaction. It's easy to judge and dehumanize when you're not interacting with someone as a human being, if you don't feel their grief, if you're not associated with the things that they associate with. So it's very easy to see them as different, and that different, again, as I said in my speech, diversity is not adversity, but because they're not interacting, as David said, in Congress, and it's easier for them to dismiss someone as a human being. And it's easier for them to condemn a thought as opposed to attempt to understand a thought. So if there was a way to be able to encourage more social interaction so that indeed we would understand that it's not just a congressman versus a congressman, it's a mother and a mother, it's a father and a father, it's a daughter and a daughter that have a difference of opinion, I think we can work through those issues in a civil manner. But if we are just in different boxes and refuse to come out of those boxes, it's going to be more difficult.
I think what I'm hearing from you all is an interesting idea that the unintended effect of what I would say is making profit king, making it so that so much time on the part of these lawmakers is in fundraising, which means I don't know how much they go time to spend playing softball with their kids and how much time they spend just fundraising when they go home. So what happens if you actually create true campaign finance reform as a way of basically making it so people then can become more personal because they don't have to run back and make the bucks to take care of their campaign. They can actually get to know each other. So there was a question. I think Carlos is going to send me a question, and he's sending it right now. And the question is this. This is from one of the participants. How would you recommend promoting and encouraging civility across power and privilege without coming across as tone policing? I guess the idea of political correctness and being perceived as perpetrating the further oppression of intersectional persons by dictating how one acts and communicates their thoughts and emotions. This had to do, by the way, Reverend Sharon, when I was hearing in terms of like the self-evaluation
Yes.
and the idea of the self-checking that you so often see people do, that literally in terms of political correctness just makes them stumble over their own minds and hearts.
It's true.
So how do you work that?
So it's an interesting question, and that is the challenge. That's one of the challenges that we face. Again, being a lawyer, certainly a civil rights advocate, certainly a pastor and a preacher, I don't want anyone to think that my press towards emotional civility in a civil society means we are curtailing freedom of speech. And civil rights and the right to advocate for what you believe in. That is not, I don't think, what any of us are saying. And certainly not what I'm saying. However, there's a chapter in my book. It's called Lions versus Kittens. And I am an attorney by trade. I graduated from Georgetown. I started out as a public defender. I was raised in New York. My tone tends to be very sharp. I was a fierce and remain a fierce advocate. And when I get riled up, my tone can sometimes be very cutting, as my mother and father would tell me. And when I made the transition, and so public defender, district attorney's office, I was senior deputy corporation counsel for Mayor Williams. I went on to teach law school, of course, and then I decided to answer my call into ministry, and stepped off of working for Mayor Williams to help build the largest faith-based organization in DC. So I was interacting with the church community, and had a staff. And when I was communicating with them, I communicated like Sharon Stiles communicates. Like I was raised to communicate very passionately. I was a public defender, so I was sharp. And so my staff and the members kept going to my pastor and saying, she's so mean. She's just so mean. And I just was scratching my head. I said, I'm not mean. I'm just making a point. And that's my tone. And he sat me down. And if he's watching, I give kudos to my Bishop Benet Staples. But he sat me down and he said, you know what, Sharon? He said, you're a lion in a room full of kittens. And when you open your mouth, you roar. And that's not to say that a lion is better than a kitten. It just says that you're in a lion in a room full of kittens. So when you open your mouth in a room full of lions, law students, other lawyers, because that's that environment and that's that community, they're going to run. They're not going to be jolted by the roar of the lion. When you go into the room of kittens as a lion, what do you think kittens are going to do when they hear a roar of a lion? They're going to shake. They might go to the bathroom on themselves. They might run out the room. They might drop dead, right? Because they're not used to that tone. He said, you can choose to continue your tone in that environment and get the result that you keep getting. And we'll just keep coming back every week. You know, I'm not firing you, but we're just going to talk about how, you know, they're afraid of you, or you can adjust your tone to the circumstance. That is what emotional maturity, as Robert Thurman suggested, as all of my colleagues commented on, and certainly as part of my book, that's what emotional maturity and emotional civility says. It is not to take away the First Amendment right. It is not tone policing, but it is recognizing that your tone, if you are operating in civility, should change and can change depending upon your room. And you don't lose your efficacy, you don't lose your power, you don't lose your point simply by understanding the room that you're in. And that's what emotional civility and emotional maturity in that sense suggest. Let me calm myself down before I speak. Does this circumstance and this point require yelling, screaming, sharpness? Or will I be more effective if I quell the tone of my voice? And I don't believe that that's tone policing. What I believe in my study of civility right now, particularly where we are in our society and our world, is that it is emotional maturity. Long-winded answer.
Good, David?
I'd love to add one thing to that. That's lovely, Dr. Anderson, Sharon. Gandhi famously said something. And by the way, I have the same tendency to, my words can hurt. And they have. And when I read this, I was very humbled. My cheeks, I'm sure, got red. Gandhi said, advice is like snow. The softer it falls, the longer it sticks, and the deeper it sinks in. And I was very humbled to read that. And I realized, my gosh, that's true.
I'll just give another example, because I do think that this is almost the crux of what we're discussing as a barrier. And I know you remember, Edgar, Judge Robert Scott on the Superior Court. Judge Scott was a very brash judge, and may God rest his soul. But he would yell and scream, and I was cross-examining a psychologist. And this isn't, again, it's not tone policing. It's just knowing your room and what effect and response do you want. And I was using the same tone and approach with a psychologist that I was using as an informant. And I wasn't getting the information that I needed for my case. And we took a break, and he called me by my name. He said, Stiles, come to the bench. And he said, you get more bees with honey. And, stormed off the bench. And I couldn't get it. And as I was like, what does that have to do with a murder case? I'm lost. But then it clicked. And, change your tone, get the information, win the case. And that's what happened. So we have to move away, Robert, I think is the point, from tone policing and that concept. We as individual human beings need to understand that words matter, tone matters, delivery of a point matters, and it should matter to you. So that when you deliver that message, or when you're trying to extract information, you can be successful. And that requires a civil approach.
Sharon, I'm finding myself moving from one mode of thinking to another. My past mode of thinking I would call dialectic, where you make your point, the other side makes its point, and you come to a synthesis. And maybe it's an easy synthesis, but I'm finding myself shifting out of that dynamic to saying, is the framework we need ecosystem? And our ecosystem's principles that we ought to be mindful of, because it means we're always calculating consequences around the dynamics of the ecosystem that we're in, no matter what its size, whether it's 3 people or whether it's hundreds or thousands. If we think ecosystem, we think differently than we think dialectically, and so I'm putting that out as a different way of framing what we're talking about.
I love it.
Can I just throw in something?
Go ahead. We got about 2 minutes, so
right.
I'd like you to all sort of wind
I want contact information so we can continue this
conversation.
conversation.
Continue this. That's for sure.
Yes.
Go ahead, David.
Well, back to our point about barriers to civility and presentation, which both of you made. A friend of mine once said to me, David, you're like a waterfall. When we're standing next to you, we can't hear anything else.
Wow.
And that embarrassed me and just stuck in me. And it was true. And, we learn by getting hammered. And Alan Watts famously said, this is another one that made my cheeks turn red. Complete self-expression in circumstances where it cannot be received is really a form of self-indulgence.
Can you type it in the chat, please? That's a good one.
complete self-expression in circumstances where it can't be received is really a form of self-indulgence. And boy, I was like, guilty as charged. Boom.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But
And we
I guess just in looking at the idea, well, actually, I think we're all ready to close down. So any questions amongst all of you? Anything you want to ask each other?
I just, I appreciate what you just said. I appreciate both of you. It's an honor to be here. But I think what we're all saying is we really have to reframe and rethink how we're approaching this discussion. So even just as Edgar said, he's looking at ecosystem versus dialectically. Both David and I are saying we've had to check ourselves and rethink how we're communicating in order to remain on that positive side of the civility, what I call the emotional civility spectrum. So what do you all think? Do you think that it's about reframing the discussion? Because for so long, it's been, we're policing tone, we're policing decorum. This is a First Amendment challenge. You're quelling free speech and my ability to just be me. But I really think it goes beyond that. What do you all think?
It's certainly more than politeness. It's really about how you nurture, fulfill, respect but full expression too. And so it's a different set of ground rules.
1 minute.
Yes.
It's not changing what you say, it's changing how you say it.
All of you, I want to thank you. This has been it's been very dynamic. And I think we're going to continue on with this. So we're bringing this to a close and we're going to be going to the breakout room shortly, but we're going back to Russ right now. So thank you.
It's been a treat. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome back. I think it's clear that we definitely had the right panelists together for that. And thank you, Bob, for pulling that together, and thank all of you for your incredible questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to them all. Okay. I also understand that we had a problem with the how you were feeling questionnaire that we tried to present at the initiation of this. So please look at your socio announcements for a link to that questionnaire. Keep in mind, you may need to refresh your screen and go through and just take a couple of moments, if you will, and tell us how you're feeling. And if it's possible, think back to 2 hours ago, how you were feeling entering this, because to let you in on a little secret, we're going to ask you at the end of tomorrow how you're feeling then, and hoping we see a difference.